Hi there, and welcome to Tales Upon the High Seas, a short story adventure series by me, Mennie. In this episode, I'm reading The Giant's Crossing, the first crossing of the North Channel between Ireland and Scotland by stand-up paddleboard in 2012. I'm reading to you from the seaside town of Portrush on the north coast of Ireland. Thank you for checking this out, and I hope you enjoy it. When I was a kid, my brother and I surfed at Castle Rock on the north coast of Ireland. Our beachside apartment overlooked the surf, some nearby headlands, and in the distance, on a clear day, two mysterious peaks protruded from the sea. These two mountains, they looked like slightly rounded off pyramids, appeared to rise out of the depths far off the coast. In fact, they are two mountains called the Paps on the Scottish island of Jura. Paps being an Old Norse word for breast. I imagine the Vikings named them as they came into these waters in their longboats. From the angle they are seen at Castle Rock, they appear to be part of the lower lying island just to the south of them, Islay, but they are in fact on the island of Jura. My brother and I would spend hours sitting at the window at Castle Rock, looking at the surf, and then jumping into the sea as and when it was at its best during each day. On the wall of the living room hung a dark wooden frame with a full-sized ocean chart in it, illustrating the waters between the north coast of Ireland and Scotland. The tip of Islay, known as the O, protruded from the very top of the chart, as if it was trying desperately not to be left off it. So, every time the mysterious islands appeared on the horizon, I would rush to look at the chart on the wall. I was fascinated by it, the depths of the water between Ireland and Scotland, the currents marked on it, the wrecks, and the mystery led to intrigue. I just always wanted to know more. At some point in my childhood, I remember looking at the chart and saying, I'm going to go there someday. At the time, I didn't know how. I was just adamant that I would go and see this place on the chart that appeared and disappeared at sea. Summer 2011. It was a roasting summer's day, the kind of rare one that takes the north coast of Ireland by surprise, and the area swamped by holidaymakers. The town of Portrush was overrun as usual for a summer's day. The sea was bright and blue and sitting almost dead still. On the horizon, behind a mirage-like sea haze, the peaks of the Paps of Jura and the sheer cliffs of Islay lying in front of them would come and go from view. I decided, right, I'm going to paddle over there. I wasn't going to do it right there and then, as I knew the North Channel to be one of the most dangerous places in the world in terms of tides. But I thought, right, that's what I will aim for. I had been stand-up paddleboarding for about 3 years at that stage, but mostly in the surf, or sup-surfing as it is often referred. I would also cruise around the local coast and into caves, etc., and the odd time trawl a hand line from a board in the hope that I might catch my dinner. I never have to date. So there and then, on my little 9.0 paddleboard, I decided to do a test run to see how I would get on. The sea was so calm that it was the perfect day for it. I grabbed my board and a summer wetsuit and drove to the little harbour on the east side of Fermor Head at Lansdowne. It took me ages to get there through the summer traffic. People were sitting in cars in the baking sun, doing laps of the town for that elusive car parking space. The harbour was deserted. It always amazes me. People come to this area, but so few are here to use the sea for anything other than a quick look at it. I drove the van down the slipway and pulled out my board and got into my wetsuit. I hadn't really planned this through. I was just going to take a paddle down the coast to the east to Runcarry Head, which I reckoned was about 5 miles away, and then I would paddle back. I had a Mars bar in the van, so I stuffed it up the leg of my wetsuit and got out under the water right away. There were hordes of tourists walking by as I left the harbour, who had clearly never seen a paddleboard before. They watched on, no doubt wondering why I was standing in my canoe or how I was surfing without waves. As I started to break away from the harbour and the bustle of the town, I started to wonder how far I would get before someone called the Coast Guard. It's a regular occurrence on the North Coast for someone who doesn't know anything about the sea to see someone else competently doing something that they aren't used to seeing and assuming they are in trouble and calling the Coast Guard. Over the years of surfing here, they have been called out to me on several occasions without need, and so I always have it in my mind. As I paddled, I was approximately equidistant between the small island chain called the Skerries to the north and the beaches of East and White Rocks to the south. Probably about a mile offshore. It was so calm. I was just cruising along. I wasn't planning on doing this in a specific time or anything. It was just a paddle to see how I go and where I am in terms of fitness, really, and to see how comfortable I am out there, relying on myself. As I approached the outcrop of rocks, known as the Storks, the tide was swinging around the shallow rise amid the deep water. I could feel the resistance against me for about 15 minutes until I passed the rocks. There is a wave that breaks off these rocks over a submerged reef. I came out here in about the year 2000 or thereabouts to surf. My friend Pete Nicole sat on the headland keeping an eye on me, and my friend and I went out there in a boat from Port Ballantrae Harbour. My friend held the boat out in the deep water channel, and I caught some waves. The reef is very uneven, with deep holes and then very shallow spots. I write this a few years after the famous red marker, the Iron Maiden, had been battered off her perch during a rare storm from the northeast. The red marker stood on the reef, marking the rocks for passing boats. Archaeologists found artefacts on the reef here dated before Christ. I assume this was a main route when Portrush was a tiny settlement with its harbour on the east side where I launched from, and these rocks maybe took down a lot of boats as there would have been no marker back then. But I don't know that as fact. On the first day I surfed out there, and again as I passed her on my test paddle, there was a clanging in the red marker. Every now and again, clang, clang. I don't know what it was, but it broke the silence on the calm summer's day. The only other noise was my paddling, breaking the surface on every stroke. The sun was beating down on me, drying out my wetsuit to the point salt stains were forming on the shoulders and arms. I decided to jump in the water just past the Storks to get wet and cool down. I carried on with my paddle. I cruised effortlessly in the beautiful weather and sea conditions along the coast, passing Dunluce Castle and on to Port Ballantrae. I felt like when I got to Port Ballantrae, I could see into the harbour and see the Bayview Hotel windows, that it was nearly done, but it's a good wee stretch to the headland at Runcarry still. I was probably a little over a mile off the coast. As I swept my way across the bay at Runcarry Beach, I heard an engine in the distance. I knew it wasn't a car engine. The car park on the headland at the beach was rammed with cars glistening in the sunshine, but I couldn't hear any noise from it. I was probably a little too far away to hear anything. I stopped moving to listen to the sound. As I looked over my shoulder, I could see the weather was changing, and out of the harbour at Port Ballantrae was a wee boat with an outboard coming towards me. The sky was turning very black out to the west, and this little white fishing boat, with what looked to be two men on board, was making a beeline straight for me. I thought, here we go. Here comes someone to tell me off. As they pulled up, I recognised one of the men. He recognised me too, but I didn't know his name. They had seen me from shore, way off the coast, and came to check I was okay. I told them I was fine, and when asked where I came from, and I told them, the man I recognised said, "Flip, that's a right wee paddle, big man." But when asked, "Where are you heading to?" and I told them I was going back to Portrush, they went silent and just kind of looked at me. Anyway, off they went, back towards the harbour and into what looked like an approaching storm. Their little white boat standing out against the contrasting blackness of the sky and horizon. I didn't really have a choice now, even if I wanted to stop. I'd come this far, I may as well go on to run Carry Head and then head back as planned. I figured, if the weather got bad, I would just head to shore, and someone I know will pass by and give me a lift back. The thing about the sea and the weather here is you can just never rely on it being constant. It is changing all the time. Once I got to run Carry Head, I pulled out my Mars bar and got it into me. I must say, the weather coming was starting to raise a little bit of concern in me. It always does. I know too well the power of the sea and what little regard it may or may not have for my little jaunt along the coast and back. I got my head down. I was no longer thinking about this as a leisurely paddle. I was just thinking about making a dent and getting back. I lay in the prone position some of the way as the wind started to come up a bit against me. It was still very calm, but I now had a little headwind, and if I lay prone, I was more streamlined than standing up against it. The whole horizon was now black. It was a heavy summer shower, probably brought on by the heat, and it was sweeping along the coast from the North Atlantic. I kept my head down and battered on. Passing Port Ballantrae, I paused for a few seconds to make a call on going on or not. Once I would pass the mouth of the bay at the harbour, I would have limited spaces to get ashore for a few miles. I was trying to judge what was coming with this big black horizon. If it was just rain and a light breeze, I would be fine. But if it was going to start howling, maybe not so. I decided to go for it. I pushed on, trying to cover as much distance as I could before the brunt of it came in. I passed Dunluce Castle and the Storks before it started to rain heavily. A few forks of lightning flashed on the horizon as the storm front passed to the north of me. It wasn't long before the horizon began to clear again. Once I was about halfway back, I started to chill a bit. I knew I'd be grand from there, even if another worse front came through. The heavy rain had dispersed a lot of the tourists from the coast, which meant that I noticed a white camper van creeping along the cliffs in the distance. I knew it. Someone would think I was in trouble. They were going so slow along the coast, it could only be that they spotted me in the distance and assumed me to be in trouble. They crawled along into the car park overlooking the Storks in the distance and sat watching me. I deliberately kept paddling, only this time faster, to make them see I was fine, covering good ground and fit as a fiddle. I was really motoring along, leaving them on the headland, far behind me. The sun was back out and roasting again, but I daren't stop or they would think there was something wrong, so I sweated it out. I just didn't want the Coast Guard called and have to come out unnecessarily when they probably have real shouts to be going to. I was determined to show these onlookers that I was completely capable. But I knew they would probably call the Coast Guard anyway. As I arrived into the extremely calm waters about a mile from the harbour I'd set off from a few hours earlier, the bustle of the town was again starting to reach me, and again another engine at sea was droning from somewhere. Around the head came the inshore lifeboat. I was sure the people in the caravan had called it. Sure enough, they pulled up beside me and said, "Oh, it's you." We just got told a windsurfer had a broken mast and was in trouble. We all laughed a bit, and they headed back to their boathouse, and I finished off the paddle back to the slipway. So, I had achieved what I set out to do in my test paddle. I then knew I was capable, and I had a taster of the fast-changing elements. I really enjoyed it, and was eager for more. So I went home, and in my head I started to think about going to Scotland, and what it would involve, the training, planning, etc. I knew the North Channel out there is well known for its hazards and wild conditions, so I needed to look at it and try and work out exactly what I was going to do and when. Planning. So I started to look into the different stretches of coastline along the North Channel. I looked at distances, tides, seabed rises, etc. All the things I was already doing and had done for years in surfing, but this time with a different objective in mind. My goal was to cross the North Channel and arrive on the Scottish island of Islay at the headland called the O that was on the chart on our living room wall. I decided that I was going to devise a list of restrictions to make the attempt as difficult, within reason, as I could for myself. I asked lots of local fishermen and sea kayakers for their input. Even that was very interesting. Several of the men, who would be considered seaworthy and are respected in a local salty sea dog capacity, clearly didn't have a clue about the North Channel when I asked them specific questions. Answers I got about tides and overfalls, etc., contradicted other answers from equally highly regarded local heroes. I was confused. Incidentally, I asked questions of people long before I ever told anyone what I planned to do. I expected negativity and doubt to be hurled at me, and I wasn't wrong. Eventually, when certain people learned of what I was planning, I was met with all sorts of, "You can't do that. Not in one of those. Not in the tides out there." One man, who claimed to have canoed there in 3 days, even tried to tell me to add a wind pennant, a centre skeg, and to drag buckets in the water behind me to keep me straight. If I told you I was going to paddle a barn door to Scotland, then that's what I would be doing. I certainly wouldn't be adapting it with any of that. I immediately felt an air of bitterness, but it was okay. I was well used to that. Got to love doubters and haters. I eventually told my friend Richard Robinson what my plans were. He was the brother of my other friend Howard, both of whom were born and bred Portrushians. I had known Howard since I was a kid. We would have gone to surf competitions together and messed about as kids. I met Richard a bit later, and he became my personal trainer for surfing. Richard is a world natural bodybuilding champion, fond of being on stage in his budgie smugglers and fake tan, but handy in a rowing boat and a high achiever. Howard, a capable surfer, ex-army, with lots of random knowledge and abilities, and handy in a boat too. These two were going to be my right-hand men for the crossing. I particularly like people with experience from doing things in life that lends them to turn their hand to all sorts of things. That is true of these two. The plan was that Ricky was going to alter my big wave surfing training regime to accommodate this new challenge. I was ordered to stop big wave surfing and anything else that may cause fatigue or injury. I started the training at the end of January. That meant my peak fitness would be right as the March equinox would come around. So, I decided I wanted to do the crossing in March, so it would be cold. I knew with the equinox in March, we often get a couple of weeks summer between March and April, where the sea is relatively calm. Howard had a boat, and the plan was he would do safety for me. My dad died in 2003, and I wanted to do this in remembrance of him. If it wasn't for him and the chart on the wall, I wouldn't ever be getting this opportunity and experience. So I contacted the charity NI Chest, Heart and Stroke and told them what I was planning to do. They were really pleased and supportive. I then issued a press release in the hope that some donations would start to roll in. Press, radio and television ran the story all over the UK and some parts of the world. But few donations came in. However, some sponsors donated equipment, a new ocean-going paddleboard from SurfTech, which immediately helped. A local fishing crew, captained by Richard Connor, saw me in the news and offered to help us navigate the route and plan the mission. I then got some funding from the local mayor, Morris Bradley, to cover the fuel for their boat and Howard's. Great support by local people. I was very appreciative of it, and it took the pressure off me and allowed me to focus on training. Within a few weeks, the stage was set. I just had to keep up my training and not sneak off to ride monsters at Mullaghmore Head and keep up with my diet. The thing was, it was clear that no one really knew what this crossing was going to take. It might have been impossible. No one knew. The route I chose was from the Giant's Causeway to the O of Islay. My reasoning was that if I left any further from the west or from the east, I would get too much benefit from the tide, and then it would be easy, and anyone could do it. I had a meeting with Richard and his crew of the Causeway Lass, and between us all, we devised a plan based on the ideal conditions and various eventualities. We set aside the 2-week window at the end of March, start of April, and hoped the conditions would be right within that time. Knowing this coast, that was a complete roll of the dice, to be honest. But with so many people now involved as support, we needed to give everyone a time frame to do this in. There was so many unknowns due to the route chosen, the channel itself, and the weather, that the training I was doing was only going to prepare me to a point. Just how much I was going to need to give on the day, no one really knew. Training. So, Ricky devised an 8-week training program. It was similar, I suppose, in some ways to marathon training. The total distance on the map I was going to do was 26 miles, which isn't far at all. We just didn't know how long this would take, or if it was even possible with the tides in the North Channel. It may have ended up being lots further, and if shit hit the fan at some point, it might have even meant waiting it out overnight for the tide to turn. We simply didn't know. So, it was kind of like starting a marathon, but not knowing what the actual distance would be, or if the course would be uphill, cross-country, or anything in between. Even on the calmest days, as soon as you go offshore at all, the sea gets rough, so we just couldn't be sure how much training was going to be enough, or too much at the outset. It's these things that I find most interesting about doing things that no one has done before. The unknown aspects are so intriguing. Often, they're the things that lead to good memories, as planning everything can often become boring. My 8-week training program consisted of sprints and long-distance paddles, a slight diet change, and the use of a mystery concoction for energy. I was training in the worst of the winter. Huge swells and northwest winds smashed their way into the coastline, one after another, week after week. I could only do some of the training at sea, and some of it on the backup routes of the River Bann and Loch Foyle, depending on the wind direction. The river days were the worst. I'd be putting in several miles in the freezing water, sometimes below the locks at the cuts in Coleraine, and sometimes above, depending on what I was doing. My legs from the feet to below the knee would freeze solid, to the point I had to get onto the riverbank and slowly get the blood in them moving before I could keep going. Every time I went out training, I had to tie the board to the roof of the van to get to the beach or the harbour. It is 14 feet long and doesn't fit inside like nearly all my other boards do. If anyone knows me, they will know I hate being noticed. There I was driving around with a 14-foot long banana on the roof. I had one calm day at sea, and I decided to head north, out into the channel. I paddled due north for 8 miles from Dunseverick Harbour on a beautiful still winter's evening. I used a GPS and was actually pulled 2 miles off course as I paddled by the time I had hit the 8-mile mark. I had a guy on a jet ski that night to cover me, and even as we drove back towards the harbour, the ski was feeling sluggish against the flow of the tide. It made me feel very aware that on the day of the paddle, I might be dragged way off course, depending on what speed I could maintain, and the size of the tide on the day we get. I knew not everything would fall into place, and to be ready for some sort of drama. For that reason, I trained endurance and strength, prone and standing, flat water, and in big stormy seas. I wanted to cover every eventuality and know that I had trained at a high level in all potential weather and sea states. One of the most memorable paddles in training was in a big raging storm. I figured, with the crossing earmarked for March, there was a chance I may end up in a storm if determination took over and I just wanted to go no matter what. So, I got to the harbour at Lansdowne. It was deserted, and I could hardly get my board off the roof without getting killed by it. The wind was wild and from the west-northwest. Waves were smashing up over the breakwall. I had chosen to paddle on peak wind, peak swell, and peak tide to get the benefit of them all, but in the roughest of conditions. The biggest issue was getting out of the harbour. The waves were breaking over the wall, across the reef pass, and smashing onto the reef. If I didn't thread the needle, I was going to get ruined big style. Thankfully, it was dawn, so no one was around to add any spectator pressure. I had a life vest on and a bunch of 500ml water bottles with my concoction in them. I stood on the grass up by the harbour. My board and paddle were sitting close to the edge of the wall, tucked out of the wind. I was up high, so I could see the approaching swell beyond the harbour out near the islands and try and find a gap. There it was. I sprinted down the grass, crossed the slipway to the board and paddle and hurled them into the harbour, and I jumped in after them. I got the board righted and climbed on. I was then below the height of the breakwater, with no eyes on the sea, so what I saw 10 seconds ago was all I had to go on. I scrambled out of the harbour, sat up, dragged my feet once I was in the front of the reef pass, swung the big board 90 degrees, and scrambled like crazy out past the harbour wall, between the dry reef and out into the deep water. The sea was huge. Big dark lumps of inky swell chewed up by the wind and white caps blowing everywhere. The swell was being magnified through the Skerries Islands to the north. I got my breath back and decided to start paddling, standing up with the wind on my back. It was so rough, but once I got up, the wind gave me momentum and I started making good progress. This is the same stretch I paddled on the sunny summer day that I used as a test paddle. This time, I was aiming to go ashore in Port Ballantrae Harbour. The storks that were dead still last time were now in mountains. White water was smashing all around them, a deep contrast to the dark deep ocean all around them. Waves were breaking at all angles, completely swamping the red marker. I was absolutely flying. I passed the storks on the northern side, and I began my approach to Port Ballantrae. The bay at Port Ballantrae Harbour has a strong current running straight out the middle of the bay. On a day like this, waves would be breaking all the way across the mouth of the bay, out at sea against this strong current. As I approached, I realised that if I didn't time this right the first time, I was going to end up missing the mouth of the bay and coming ashore through the huge waves at Runcarry Beach that were also breaking way out at sea. The mouth of the bay, where the harbour is about 100 yards wide. As I approached, the swell and surf were so big, I couldn't determine where the opening was. The entire coastline was being smashed by gigantic swell, so the black basalt was pure white like the sea, and I just couldn't tell where I was. I was reluctant to pass the mouth. I had to get this right first time. If I went too close to shore, I would risk being thrown up onto the rocks. I tried to slow myself down and drift, but even then I was moving fast. I could see the Bayview Hotel on the hill and used it as my marker. I started to paddle at an angle with the plan that once I passed the western side of the mouth, about 200 yards offshore, I would turn and start to race in the gap and try and use a swell line to move me so as the current coming out didn't stop me. Off I went. Everything went well until as soon as I passed the opening of the mouth of the bay, the outgoing current made an incoming swell line start to stand up and grow tall. I thought, uh-oh, here we go. If this breaks, I'm dead. The massive wall of dark water stood and started marching towards the mouth of the bay. I kept glancing over my shoulder, trying to keep moving ashore, not get pulled past the opening, and if I got lucky, time this swell and possibly catch it. I got the head down and caught it. I started to take off down the face of this thing that was way bigger than twice the length of my 14-foot board. It didn't really break, but it capped at the top and knocked me off my board. I lost my paddle, the board, and all my water bottles, and I got ragdolled around. I was not concerned, only that I was in the middle of the bay and all my stuff was scattered. I swam and got my board and paddle. Thankfully, another wave didn't come, and I was just inside the mouth of the bay. I scrambled the board into the western end where the reef break is and allowed myself to get washed ashore from there as it was out of the deep water current. That was a serious paddle. That was more about local ocean knowledge and surf ability than it was about paddling ability. I paddled over to the harbour and checked my time. I did that in 53 minutes. I also did a long distance training session from Benone Strand to Dunsefrick Harbour one day. This day, there was a 4.8 metre swell, clean sea state for the most part, and a light to moderate southwest wind. Even at Benone, there was quite a bit of surf and lines of whitewater. I got a few beatings trying to get the board out back, but eventually got out there. I again had GPS on, As I passed Castle Rock's bar mouth, I recorded a wave height of 18 feet. It was a clean rolling swell, very different to the previous paddle. There was a bit of chop here and there, and I switched to prone for some of it, but the conditions were pretty forgiving until I got to Ben Gore Head. The tide turned, and it was like hitting a brick wall. I literally came to a standstill and was paddling like a madman going nowhere, just holding ground. I had just passed the Giant's Causeway and was north of the furthest cliff to the east before the turn in the coastline to Port Moon and Dunseverick. I was probably about 300 yards offshore, maybe more. I decided to move closer to shore, using the rise in the swell to give me some push. Once I got closer to the cliff, I started to use the momentum of the swell surges around the rocks to drag me along. Eventually, I hugged the headland and slipped around the corner. The tide was sweeping around the bay against me. I had just paddled for 4 hours, and the last stretch of about 1 mile took me 90 minutes more. It took all in 5 hours, 23 minutes before I made it all the way into the harbour. Again, the North Channel showed me what it can do to my progress in an instant. I was starting to wonder what was coming on the day. The day. So we made the call. I spent most of the day before organising food for all the crew, making sandwiches, etc. The plan was meet at 4:30 a.m. at Portrush Harbour. Boats were fueled up the night before. 4:30 a.m. meet, get all the gear onto the boats, and I was going to set off to the causeway in my van on my own, and the 2 boats would meet me at the causeway a few hundred yards offshore at 6 a.m. I began to walk in the pitch black to the causeway down the hill. It was about 5:30 a.m. when I arrived at the stones and lay down on my back. I lay there for a minute or two, telling myself that when I enter the water, I will not stop until I reach Scotland. It was a moment of calm. Then in the darkness, I noticed the navigation lights of the support crew come into the bay. It was go time. I stood up, picked up my board, and walked to the edge of the hexagonal rocks. A beautiful still morning with a slight surge of small swell brushing along the rocks. I jumped off the rocks to the eastern side of the causeway, where it is slightly deeper and has fewer protruding rocks. As I left, I mistimed it in the dark and fell into the water. I lost my drinks bottles again and drowned my radio. I was raging, but got back on my board and prone paddled out to the boats in the dark. The sky behind was turning a bright yellow above the black, dark cliffs of the Causeway Bay. We had a quick safety brief, and Richard set off to get ahead of me and give me my route. Howard stayed just off to the side of me and checked radios with Richard so they could communicate progress, etc. Richard had his crew and I had mine scattered between the 2 boats. I had a spare board and a paddle on the boat too, 7 litres of my energy concoction and a few sandwiches kept aside from everyone else's in case I got sick of drinking that. Off we went. I started off in the calm water, moving well. As the sun came up and started to break the darkness, the golden light reflected all around. It was a perfect morning to be setting off. We couldn't have scored any better. I was just west of Rathlin Island, which lies about 6 miles offshore, when I began to be picked up by the tide. I was moving well with it, to the point that as we were hitting the 10-mile mark, Richard joked over the radio that he was going to call the hotel on Isla and tell him to get our lunch ready for midday. I was absolutely flying along. I was 12 miles into the crossing when things started to change. The tide started to slow down, and my speed gradually dropped off. I was not far from a shallow rise in the seabed called the Middle Bank when I started to really notice a change. The surface was starting to get choppy. The wind was coming up from the southeast, and the small swell was breaking up my path. Shellfish boats were fishing the bank as I approached, and Richard had to radio the captains of a big carrier ship and an oil platform to have them change course for us. Richard hoped that about another hour of solid paddling, and I would break over to the northern side of the Middle Bank. I was still paddling as fast as I was when I left the shore, but my progress was dissipating quickly. I set off at about 5 miles per hour, and at the very worst, my speed dropped to 0.2 miles per hour at one stage. This was with constant paddling. I didn't stop once, except to take drinks. So with the same paddle pace, I had dropped to virtually a standstill. I was starting to literally climb the tide as it tried to force me back. I had to hold ground and paddle against it. I was only halfway across the North Channel at this stage. I was about to start into the toughest bit of the paddle, with the third hour of the dropping tide about to attempt to take me out. The third hour is usually the hour of tide with the biggest movement. I had no choice but to keep paddling. This is exactly what we didn't know about in training. We just didn't know to what extent and where I was going to face some sort of trouble and how bad that trouble may be. It was so choppy, I was getting thrown off my board, which wasn't helping, so I stayed in prone for quite a while. Hours 4, 5, 6 and 7 became a blur of continual paddling, alternating between prone and stand-up, and getting continual location checks from Howard via Richard. Keep in mind, the longest training paddle I had done was 5 hours 23 minutes of continual paddling. I was now in my 7th hour, and I was only about 2/3 of the way across the channel. Although I was winning. Once I got to that point, I felt like I had broken free from the deepest, fastest flowing section of the channel, where all the turbulence and chop was at its wildest, and I figured that the final stretch would be gradually easier all the way into the landing spot. I always talk about things at sea, and often in life too, going wrong, and to always be prepared for them, and to go even more wrong before they get better. That was about to happen. Just as everyone started to breathe a sigh of relief that we weren't going to turn around or have to wait until dark, and I was starting to pick up speed again, we got hit from the side. I was within a couple of miles of making landfall. I could even see the landing spot, and I had broken free from the clutches of the North Channel tide, and I was on my way to the end until the Sea of Jura had other ideas. Little did we know that the Sea of Jura drains south and then turns west. I now assume it must clash with the flow in the main channel and get turned to the west by it. It picked me up and turned me 90 degrees. I was being swept along the coast of Islay in what was only akin to a rapid. I have experienced this on the southwest corner of Rathlin before, where the tide races along the cliffline, but we weren't expecting it now after 8 hours of non-stop paddling. It was insane. I was virtually making no progress again, this time being swept to the west and being held back. It was so serious that Richard thought for a moment we were going to miss the island altogether, and I would be swept out into the Atlantic and have to work my way back to the island on the western coast. Both boats' crews started shouting at me in encouragement. I eventually got to the cliffline, much further west than we had planned to arrive. I approached the sheer cliffs, and to my surprise my friend on Islay, Marcus Koval, had watched it all unfolding and followed me from the proposed landing spot to where I eventually got ashore. He climbed down the cliff and came to congratulate me. I stood up with my board on the rocks and punched the air. That was a mission. I ended up landing below the American Monument, a memorial marking the sinking of 2 ships just off the coast there, in which lots of lives were lost. Marcus presented me with the goat's skull mounted on a piece of wood that he had found just above where I landed as an award. We all went to the harbour in Port Ellen and had a drink in the hotel and chilled out for a while before taking the trip back to Portrush, arriving back in port after dark. Mission accomplished. In the training paddle from Benone Strand to Dunseverick Harbour, I had reached 23 miles in just over 5 hours along the coast of Northern Ireland, with various elements causing trouble at times. On the day of the Giant's Crossing, the original 26 miles became a few more, and the total crossing was 9 hours and 25 minutes long, almost twice what it took to do the same distance in training. The elements at sea are a massive unknown quantity, and virtually impossible to predict what impact they may or may not have. It goes to show that physical training is really important for confidence, stamina, and endurance against the elements, but equally important against the elements was my knowledge of the ocean, input from others, my own ability, and my mental preparation and determination, which basically boils down to complete stubbornness. I was later referred to by skipper Richard Connor, who navigated my route, as, "You're the thickest man I've ever met." I wasn't quite sure how to take that at the start, but it turns out to be a colloquialism for determined or stubborn, which in this case I would have to agree with. I did the challenge to raise money for Northern Ireland Chest, Heart and Stroke Association, and I am very grateful to all the people who donated over £2,500 and all my sponsors who helped me to achieve it. This was without doubt one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. None of this would have been possible if it wasn't for the support from great friends and local businesses. The end. Thank you for listening to this episode of Tales Upon the High Seas. The Giant's Crossing was written and the voice recording was performed by me, Mennie, in Portrush, Northern Ireland. The sound was mastered and engineered by Miguel Oliveira in Porto, Portugal. Thanks for listening.